He held up the faded photo like it was a joke. "Mom, was this your sexy phase or your sad one?" Laughter rippled across the table. His fiancée, his friends, even his future in-laws. My cheeks burned. That photo was taken the day I found out I was pregnant. Alone, scared, and smiling anyway. He didn't know that same photo had been tucked beneath the down payment check I gave him. I looked at my son and thought, "You're sitting on a home built with my silence." Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below. When I was 23, I used to smile like the world hadn't touched me yet. That photo, faded now, edges soft with time, was taken on the day I came home from my first prenatal appointment. I was alone, already bruised from the truth that the man who made that baby wanted nothing to do with either of us. I remember sitting cross-legged on the floor of my studio apartment, a second-hand camera in one hand and my other resting gently on the barely there curve of my stomach. I took that photo myself. People always say motherhood is a choice. For me, it was a vow. I didn't know how I'd pay rent some months. I worked nights at a diner, walked dogs in the morning, and picked up temp jobs in between. I gave up everything, art school, friendships, the idea of romance. But I had a baby boy who looked at me like I was the whole sky, and that was enough for a long time. By the time he was 4, I'd learned how to stretch spaghetti into a 3-day meal, how to fix a leaky sink with duct tape, and how to cry into my pillow so he wouldn't hear. I never remarried, not because I didn't want love, but because I couldn't bring myself to bring anyone into our little world who might love him less than I did. That was my soft spot, and maybe my blind spot too. As he grew older, I told myself the sacrifices were worth it. When he got into college, I cashed out the last of my savings for his tuition deposit. When he struggled with his first job, I let him move back in, no questions asked. When his father died suddenly, just a stranger's name on paper by then, I was the one who organized the funeral because my son didn't know where to start. I made it easy for him. Too easy, maybe. Still, I never asked for anything. Not recognition, not repayment, just respect. And maybe, deep down, a little warmth. A little acknowledgement that I'd built my entire life around his. But years passed, and the gratitude I hoped for faded into something else. Expectation, entitlement, distance. When he got engaged, I felt that familiar flicker of hope again. Maybe this would be a fresh chapter, a chance to be part of something, wedding planning, shared holidays, Sunday dinners. But instead, it was the beginning of a quiet exile. His fiancée, Alyssa, was poised, educated, well-dressed. She also made it clear, in 1,000 polite ways, that I was quaint. I didn't belong to the world she was curating. I was an artifact, a sweetheart she could tolerate in short doses. But I bit my tongue, again and again, because that's what I'd trained myself to do: soften, yield, support. I handed over a check for $48,000, the down payment for their first home, as a wedding gift. Money I'd saved from my husband's pension and later from teaching night classes at the local community center. I told myself I was giving them roots. I told myself this was love. What I didn't realize was that somewhere along the way, I had become invisible. The photo album was the last thing I brought over to their house. It was sentimental, really, a bridge between the past and what I hoped would be our shared future. I'd imagined one day my grandchild might flip through its pages and see how much love their family was built on. But that day at brunch, when my son laughed at that photo, my photo, it felt like something sacred had been desecrated. It wasn't the joke itself. It was what it told me, that he saw me as small, silly, outdated. He didn't see the woman who had clawed her way through life to make his possible. He saw a punchline, and just like that, everything inside me that had quietly endured for decades snapped. I was the woman behind every stable moment in his life. But that day, I realized I'd erased myself so thoroughly, even my own son had forgotten I was ever more than a backdrop. If I'm being honest, I never thought I'd be one of those mothers who gave too much. I thought I was simply doing what love required. When my son Daniel met Alyssa, he was 2 years into a job he didn't particularly enjoy, renting a small apartment on the edge of downtown and still calling me when he couldn't figure out how to cook rice without burning. Alyssa was different. She came from a family with country club memberships, second homes, and conversations that sounded more like negotiations. From the moment she entered his life, she began editing it. She had ideas about what kind of career he should pursue, how he should dress, who he should associate with. At first, I thought she was just ambitious for him. Supportive, maybe. But little by little, Daniel started changing. He swapped his beat-up Honda for a leased Audi, started using phrases like building equity and leveraging social capital. He still called, but the calls became shorter, more transactional, and then came the big ask. They were getting married and wanted to buy a house before the wedding. It would help them establish stability, Alyssa said. Her parents had already contributed $30,000, and if I could match it or come close, they could afford a place in a good school district. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to help, but because it was all so sudden. But Daniel reassured me. It's not a loan, Mom. It's a gift for everything you've ever done. He hugged me then, warm and boyish, like he used to. I folded. I withdrew $48,000 from the joint account I'd once shared with his father, the last of the retirement cushion we'd built. I told myself it was symbolic. The torch was being passed. The house was everything Alyssa had dreamed of. 3 bedrooms, a manicured lawn, a kitchen with marble countertops, and a gas stove she'd never cook on. I helped unpack the boxes the first day they moved in. Daniel barely looked up from his phone. Alyssa assigned me to the linen closet. They gave me a guest room, just in case I wanted to stay overnight. But I noticed the closet was already full of her handbags and off-season coats. A silent message. I visited a few times in the first month, dropped off banana bread, offered to help hang curtains. But the house never felt like mine in any way. The way Alyssa politely corrected me, "Oh, we don't really use those kinds of plates anymore," or "That's not really our aesthetic," made me feel like a housekeeper showing up uninvited. Still, I persisted. I brought over the photo album one afternoon, gently placing it on their coffee table while they were out. I thought they'd be curious, that maybe, just maybe, they'd leaf through it and ask questions about the stories behind those photos. I imagined sitting on the couch, telling Alyssa about the dress I wore in 1987, or the time Daniel stuck a peanut up his nose at age 4. But the album stayed closed. Days passed, then weeks, and then came brunch. A Sunday gathering at their new place meant to build connections with Alyssa's family and Daniel's college friends. I was asked to bring a casserole. When I arrived, my photo album had been moved to a side table, placed beneath a stack of design magazines. Someone must have opened it. A page was splayed, exposing that photo. The one of me in my tiny apartment, eyes tired but proud, a baby belly visible beneath a cotton dress. I hadn't worn makeup. My hair was pulled back, but I was smiling. Daniel held it up like a novelty, chuckling. "Look at this. Mom doing her sad single lady cosplay." There was laughter, real laughter, from Alyssa, from her mother, even from one of his friends. My body froze, but my mind didn't. It sprinted backward through every moment I'd swallowed pride in the name of motherhood. Every scraped knee I kissed, every shift I worked while sick, every time I smiled through loneliness, just so he'd never feel it. And all I could think was, this is the home I helped build. These are the walls I paid for. And this is what lives inside them. I thought I was giving him a future, but what I'd really given him was permission to forget my past. The brunch incident cracked something in me, but I didn't react, not then. I smiled tightly, picked at my fruit salad, and nodded through the rest of the gathering like nothing had happened. Years of swallowing. Emotion had made me fluent in invisibility. But silence has weight. It doesn't disappear. It settles in your joints, your chest, your sleep. After that day, something shifted in how I looked at Daniel and how I looked at myself. I started paying closer attention. And what I saw, I couldn't unsee. It wasn't just one offhanded insult. It was a pattern I'd trained myself to excuse. There had been the time he forgot my birthday entirely because he was slammed with work, only for Alyssa to post a picture that same day of the two of them at a vineyard tasting. Or the dinner where she introduced me to her friends as Dan's mom. She used to be a teacher or something. I had taught for 27 years. I'd earned degrees and molded hundreds of young lives. But in that moment, I became an accessory, background noise to their curated success. He never corrected her. He never stopped to ask how I was doing. Even when I had surgery on my hand, an old injury that had worsened with arthritis, he didn't visit. Sent a text. Hope it went well. Let me know if you need anything. I did need something. I needed to not feel like a ghost in my own life. I tried to explain my hurt once, quietly, without accusation. I told him I felt distant, like I didn't quite fit into the life he was building. He sighed, already distracted by a work email on his phone, and said, "Mom, you're just sensitive. You always read too much into things." Sensitive. That word used to feel like an embrace. Now it felt like an eraser. And then, a week after the brunch, I returned to their house to pick up a baking dish I'd left behind. I walked in through the side gate, as I often did, and heard them talking inside, Daniel and Alyssa in the kitchen, unaware I was nearby. "She's harmless," Daniel was saying. "Just old and emotional. She'll get over it," Alyssa laughed. "We really need to start setting firmer boundaries with her. She's always there, not even here, like I was a nuisance hovering in the background of their perfect little life." I backed away, my hands trembling, the dish forgotten. I got into my car and sat there for 15 minutes before turning the key. That night, I opened the photo album again for the first time since it had been mocked. I sat on my bed, running my fingers over the worn corners, my eyes tracing the image of that young woman I used to be. She looked brave. Not beautiful, not polished, but real. Strong in the quietest, rawest way. She didn't deserve to be ridiculed. Not by the boy she gave everything to. I thought about all the times I'd said yes when I meant I can't, and it's fine when I meant this hurts. I thought about the down payment, the $48,000 I'd handed over with a smile and a blessing. I had written that check thinking I was giving my son a home. I hadn't realized I was writing myself out of it. What haunted me most wasn't the money. It was the realization that I had raised a son who could stand on a foundation I built and still look down on the hands that built it. I had become the woman who gave without limits, and in doing so, taught him that I had none. But that illusion was about to end, starting with the check he thought was his forever. That night, after overhearing what my son said, "She's just old and emotional. She'll get over it," I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, but inside me everything roared. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of cold tea, staring at the photo album like it was an open wound. I turned the pages slowly, letting the images pull me backward. There he was, age 3, arms wrapped around my leg, snot on his cheek, beaming like I hung the moon. I remembered that day. We'd missed the city bus, and I had to carry him 3 blocks in the rain so he wouldn't be late to preschool. My back had ached for 2 days after. He'd looked up at me and said, "You're like a superhero, Mama." He used to say things like that. There was another picture, his 8th birthday. I had made a homemade cake shaped like a dinosaur, though. I had no idea what I was doing. The kitchen was covered in green frosting. He had laughed so hard when the tail fell off, and then I turned to a photo I hadn't looked at in years. Me and him at a hospital. He was 11, recovering from an asthma attack. I was holding his hand. What the photo didn't show was that I had missed my own mother's funeral that day. She'd passed away in another state, but Daniel had collapsed at school. I'd had to choose, attend the burial or stay by his hospital bed. I chose him without question. I never even told him about the funeral. I didn't want him to carry that guilt. It hit me hard. I had spent his whole life protecting him from the weight of my own, and now I was a burden? A joke? I closed the album and pressed it to my chest. The tears didn't come fast. They arrived slow, warm, quiet. The kind of crying you do when something deep inside finally gives out. But mixed in with the pain, there was something else. Clarity. This wasn't just about a photo or a brunch or even $48,000. This was about how much of myself I'd erased to be everything for someone else, and how little of me was left when that someone else no longer needed me. I walked to my closet, pulled out the fireproof box that held my most important papers, life insurance, my will, my savings documents. I sat back down and stared at the statement showing the withdrawal I'd made for Daniel's down payment. I had never asked for anything in writing. No agreement, no record. Just trust. But trust is a fragile currency. I picked up my phone and scrolled to the name of an attorney a friend had once recommended. I didn't call yet, but I stared at the number like it was a key to a door I wasn't sure I wanted to open. Then I picked up the album again, opened to that photo, the one Daniel had mocked. I stared at her. That young woman, pregnant and alone, still daring to smile, and I whispered to her, "I'm sorry I let him laugh at you. I won't let it happen again." Have you ever felt taken for granted by someone you love deeply? I'd really like to hear your story in the comments. That night, I didn't just cry, I woke up. And when a mother wakes up after a lifetime of sacrifice, the world around her starts to shift. The next morning, the world looked a little different. Not brighter, not easier, just clearer. I poured myself a real breakfast, not just toast or leftover casserole, and sat down at the table without the photo album in front of me for once. I didn't feel lighter, but I did feel awake. That was something. Later that day, I walked past a watercolor shop tucked between the pharmacy and the post office. I used to paint. Before motherhood took over, I had dreams of illustrating children's books. I stood outside the shop for a long moment, my hand pressed to the glass. Then, without thinking, I walked inside and bought a small starter kit. Just a few tubes of color, a pad, and 2 brushes. That afternoon, I painted a pear. It was clumsy, uneven, but it was mine. And I realized, when was the last time I created something just for me? I started making a list, not of groceries or appointments, or tasks for other people. A list of things I wanted to reclaim. Small things, quiet things. Pieces of myself I'd long ago abandoned. Paint once a week. Read a novel cover-to-cover walk without a destination. Speak without apologizing. That same week, I signed up for a book club at the local library. I almost didn't go. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, considering turning around. But I went in. The room smelled like old wood and coffee. The women were kind. One of them, Marion, had silver hair and a laugh like a tambourine. She offered me a seat and said, "You look like you've got a story or two in you." She had no idea. That night, I slept without waking. 2 days later, I called the attorney. Her name was Lisette, soft-spoken, sharp-eyed. I told her everything, the money, the lack of documentation, my intentions, my regrets. She listened without judgment. When I asked if there was anything I could do to legally reclaim the money, she paused, then said, "Actually, there might be. Turns out, because the funds were withdrawn from a personal retirement account and there was no gift affidavit, I could issue a formal rescission based on undue influence, especially if I could show financial vulnerability or dependency. Pyax. Not trying to punish my son, I said quietly. I understand, she replied, but you're allowed to protect yourself. That night, I sat on my porch with a pen in hand and wrote something I never imagined I'd write. A formal letter to my own child requesting the return of funds. But it wasn't just about money. It was about meaning, about boundaries, about asking, finally, to be seen not just as a giver, but as a person. When the letter was mailed, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, solid, like the ground under me wasn't shifting anymore, and still, life moved on. Marion from book club invited me to a community art night. I brought my pear painting. Someone said it reminded them of grief and tenderness. I almost cried in the middle of the room. Daniel didn't call right away. I knew he'd received the letter. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. I had learned to breathe without his approval. I didn't take back the money to hurt him. I did it to save what was left of me. And for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for his permission to feel whole. It took exactly 6 days after he received the letter. The phone rang late in the evening, just as I was settling in with my book and a cup of chamomile. The screen flashed Daniel, and for a split second I almost didn't answer. But old habits are hard to break. Are you serious right now? His voice was sharp, clipped, like I'd insulted him. Yes, I said calmly. I am. I could. Hear Alyssa in the background, muffled, irritated. Then Daniel again. You're trying to take back the down payment? After everything I've done? After everything you said? I breathed in slowly. I never said the money was unconditional. I said it was a gift for your future. I didn't know your future had no room for me in it. Silence. Then, you're unbelievable. No, I replied softly. I've just stopped being invisible. He hung up. No goodbye. I sat there, still holding the phone, my tea growing cold beside me. I thought I would feel shattered, but I didn't. What I felt was something more surprising. Relief. 2 days later, a certified envelope arrived at my door. Inside was a letter from Alyssa's lawyer. Legal threats, accusations of emotional manipulation, vague references to damages. I read the first page and then put it in a drawer. I didn't cry, I didn't panic. I called Lisette. She handled it. Quietly, cleanly. She sent a return notice asserting my legal rights, backing it with state law, financial precedent, and, most importantly, my documented history of support, which painted a very different picture than theirs. That same week, Daniel's calls stopped altogether. I thought I'd feel emptier than I did. But something strange happened in that silence. I began to hear myself think again. At book club, I laughed at something without faking it. I painted something other than a pear, a window with light pouring through it. Marion said it looked like starting over. At the grocery store, I passed a young couple arguing over brands of laundry detergent. The woman's voice was clipped, condescending. I wondered if that was how Alyssa sounded when no one else was around. I started sleeping through the night again. Then the mortgage notice arrived. Not to me, but to Daniel. A friend of mine who works at the county office had mentioned something in passing. A lien notice had been filed on the house. It turned out Alyssa's parents had quietly withdrawn their contribution when they learned about the legal conflict. Without both sets of funds, the loan terms collapsed. The house, the one I helped buy, was in jeopardy. I didn't gloat. I didn't reach out. I simply let it be. A week later, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Daniel standing there. No suit, no polished smile, no car keys jingling in his hand. Just my son, looking older than I remembered, tired in a way I couldn't parent away. He didn't speak right away. Just stood there, then handed me a plain envelope. Inside was a check for the full $48,000. I had to borrow some, he said quietly. Sell some things. I'll probably have to move. Alyssa left. I looked up at him, waiting for the anger, the guilt, the bargaining, but he didn't offer any. I didn't come to argue, he said. I came because I think I forgot who you were, and I'm not proud of that. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just nodded and stepped aside so he could come in. He didn't. He shook his head and said, "Not yet, but maybe sometime." And then he left. I stood there with the envelope in my hand and realized I hadn't lost anything. Not really. I had just begun to remember what I'd spent my whole life forgetting. I thought taking back the money would break us. But it was silence that cracked the facade, and truth that finally made space for something real to begin. After he left, I didn't cash the check right away. I placed it on the mantel, beside a small candle and a dried rose from the bouquet I'd saved when Daniel graduated high school. It wasn't a shrine. It was a moment in time. Proof that something had shifted. Not just in him, but in me. The house was quiet, but my days weren't empty. I filled them deliberately, walking the trail by the river each morning, painting with Marion in the afternoons, reading aloud to children at the local library once a week. I found that I could still give, but from fullness, not from sacrifice. A few weeks passed before Daniel reached out again. He sent a text, short and cautious. "Would you want to get lunch sometime? Just the two of us. My treat." I waited a day before, responding, not to play games, just to be sure I wanted to say yes, and I did. Not out of nostalgia, but curiosity. I wanted to meet the man he was trying to become. We met at a small diner we used to go to when he was a teenager, the kind with cracked booths and syrup-sticky menus. He looked different, less polished, more real. The first thing he said when he sat down was, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know I see it now. All of it. What you gave, what I took." I didn't say anything for a while. I just looked at him and tried to see not the boy I raised or the man who mocked me, but the person sitting across from me now. Someone in between, someone unfinished. He told me Alyssa had left 2 weeks after the legal notice arrived. She hadn't wanted a life full of family drama. He said that without bitterness, more like someone accepting the ending of a story they thought would last longer. "I know I made a mess," he said. "I don't blame you for pulling the money. I blame myself for needing the pull to finally grow up." I listened, not like a mother waiting to comfort, but like a woman finally, being addressed with truth. "I was angry at you," he admitted. "But not because of the money, because you stopped playing the part I got used to, the one where you fix everything quietly." That landed deep. We didn't resolve everything that day, but we started something better than resolution. We started honesty. A week later, he called to tell me he'd found a small apartment. Humble, but enough. He'd taken a job with a local nonprofit helping elderly clients file for housing assistance. He said it was humbling work, said it made him think of me more often than he was ready for. "I wish I could go back," he said. During one call, I stopped him gently. "You can't. But you can go forward, that's what matters." He started visiting once a week. Not for help, not for favors, just to sit, to talk, sometimes to bring me flowers. We didn't talk about the house, or Alyssa, or the brunch. We talked about books, about childhood memories, about the little things, the real things. One Sunday, we sat on the porch and I handed him the photo album. He held it without opening it. "I don't deserve to look through this," he said. "You didn't earn it," I replied, "but you inherited it. That's the difference." He nodded slowly. Then he opened it. Page by page, he studied the images. He paused on that photo, the one he had once ridiculed. He looked at it longer than any of the others. "God," he whispered. "You look so alone." "I was," I said. "But I was also strong. You just didn't know what strength looked like back then." His eyes filled, and for once he didn't try to hide it. He looked up at me and said, "I'm sorry, Mom, for all of it, not just the brunch, for years of not seeing you." And there it was, not redemption, not closure, but truth, soft and steady, the kind you could build a new foundation on. He finally saw the woman behind the sacrifices, not as a ghost of his childhood, but as the architect of his survival, and, with that vision, something long buried between us began to live again. Healing is not a moment. It's a rhythm, a slow, steady returning. Daniel and I didn't fix everything overnight. Some things we never talked about again. The harsh words, the brunch, the old wounds, they didn't need to be relived. What mattered was what we did next. He started coming by on Sundays, sometimes with a bag of groceries, sometimes with stories from work. He'd taken on a role that involved helping elderly clients with housing applications. Ironic, really. He said it was the first time he'd truly understood how much it costs someone to give up their comfort for someone else's. "I met a woman last week," he told me one afternoon. She'd been supporting her daughter and grandkids for over a decade, still clipping coupons, still giving everything. And you know what she said to me? I looked at him. She said, "When you give and give, and they still don't see you, it starts to feel like dying in slow motion." He paused. "That's how I made you feel, didn't I?" I didn't answer. I just reached across the table and touched his hand. I'd waited so long for my son to grow into a man who could understand me not just as a parent, but as a person. That moment, as small as it was, felt like the miracle I never thought I'd get. We never discussed the check again. I didn't cash it. Instead, I shredded it. He never asked why. But I think he knew, because that gesture, that envelope left on my doorstep, was the only form of repayment I ever wanted. Not the money, the recognition, the humility, the love that didn't come with conditions or excuses. That photo album now sits on my coffee table, not tucked away, not hidden. Sometimes when Daniel visits, he opens it and laughs, not at the pictures, but with them, with me. One day, he brought someone new over, a kind, soft-spoken woman named Helen. Not flashy, not sharp-tongued. She wore a cardigan with a coffee stain on the sleeve and helped me clean up after lunch. As she washed dishes, she turned to me and said, "He talks about you all the time, says you're the strongest woman he knows." I smiled, but inside, something deeper stirred. Not pride, not ego, just relief. Like after decades of running, I could finally sit down. The home I used to dream of, one filled with respect, warmth, and a little bit of earned silence, wasn't in a house I'd paid for. It was right here, in the steady return of my son's presence, reshaped by humility. Daniel still stumbles. He still forgets to call sometimes. But when he does call, he asks about me, my book club, my paintings, my bad knee. He listens. That was all I ever needed. Sometimes we walk through the old neighborhood together. He points to the corner where he learned to ride his bike. I point to the stoop where I once cried after a 12-hour shift. We don't talk about everything. We don't have to. Love is quieter now, but it's real. Have you ever had to set a hard boundary with someone you love? How did it change things? I'd love to know your story in the comments. I never cashed the check, because what I needed wasn't money, it was a mirror. And when my son finally held it up, I saw the woman I'd always been. If you had asked me a year ago who I was, I would have said, a mother. Full stop. Now I might say, a woman who raised a son, survived heartbreak, painted a pear, and finally learned how to say no. Without guilt, not in defiance, but in self-respect. It's strange How long we can live inside stories we didn't mean to write. For decades, mine was a tale of sacrifice disguised as strength, giving disguised as love. But the truth is, I had confused endurance for value. I thought being everything for someone else was the same as being someone at all. The day my son mocked. That photo, I felt something break. But maybe it needed to. Maybe all those years of stretching myself thin were never sustainable. Maybe quiet dignity has limits, and maybe, just maybe, those limits matter more than we're taught to believe. Often think of that photo now, the one he laughed at. I don't see a joke. I see a girl on the edge of everything hard and beautiful, still standing. I see someone who didn't yet know the cost of being needed. But who gave anyway? That photo is no longer a symbol of pain. It's an origin story. 2. Every woman watching this who has been taken for granted, dismissed, or made to feel invisible. You are not a background character. You are not a disposable chapter. You are the author, and you are allowed to turn the page. Sometimes love means helping. Sometimes it means letting go. And sometimes, when the moment demands it, love means standing up and saying, "That's enough." Not out of anger, but out of memory, out of truth. Daniel and I are still writing our story. But now, I write with both hands, his and mine. There's space for both, and if he ever forgets again, I know what I'll do. Not retreat, not beg, but rise, because this time I remember who I am, and I won't be laughed out of my own life again. We all carry moments where we allowed too much and asked too little. If this story touched something inside you, something you've buried or lived through, I hope you'll share your truth in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing me. And please, if you're holding back your voice, let it rise.